Hello guys. I hope you all are doing well, and today's video is gonna be about the American science fiction horror film, Life. Let's get right into the video. In the near future, an unmanned space probe returns from Mars to Earth orbit with soil samples potentially containing evidence of extraterrestrial life. The probe is intercepted by the International Space Station. From its samples, exobiologist Hugh Derry revives a dormant cell that quickly grows into a multi-celled organism that U.S. schoolchildren name Calvin. Hugh realizes that Calvin's cells can change their specialization, acting as muscle, neuron, and photosensory cells all at once. During an experiment, Calvin becomes hostile, wrapping itself around Hugh's hand and crushing it. Calvin then escapes its enclosure and devours a lab rat, growing in size. Engineer Rory Adams rescues Hugh, but Calvin grabs onto his leg, prompting physician David Jordan to lock Rory in the lab. After Rory unsuccessfully attempts to destroy Calvin with a flame-throwing incinerator, Calvin enters his mouth, devouring his internal organs and killing him. After several minutes, Calvin emerges from Rory's mouth, larger than before, and escapes the lab through a fire control vent. The crew attempts to inform Earth of the situation, but the station's communication system overheats, cutting off contact with Earth. ISS Commander Ekaterina Kat Golovkina performs a spacewalk to find and fix the problem, which turns out to be Calvin. Calvin attacks Kat and ruptures her spacesuit's coolant system. As her suit fills with coolant, Kat makes her way to the airlock. She and the crew realize that Calvin will re-enter the station if they let her in, so she chooses to stay outside, and drowns in her spacesuit. Calvin attempts to re-enter the station through its maneuvering thrusters. The crew fire the thrusters to blast it away, but they drain so much fuel that it causes the ISS to enter a decaying orbit, where it will burn up in Earth's atmosphere. Pilot Sho Murakami suggests using the ISS's remaining fuel to get back into a safe orbit, even though it will allow Calvin to re-enter. The crew seal themselves in one side of the station and prepare to vent the atmosphere from the other side to render Calvin dormant. Hugh spots Calvin while the crew is working but chooses not to report the creature. At some point, Calvin latches onto his leg and begins feeding off him before the crew finishes sealing off the section where Calvin is supposed to be contained. The crew discovers Calvin feeding off of Hugh after he unexpectedly dies. Calvin attacks the crew, forcing them to flee. Sho seals himself inside a sleeping pod, while Calvin tries to break inside. David and Quarantine Officer Miranda North use Hugh's corpse as bait to lure Calvin away and trap it. Having received a distress call prior to the damage to the ISS communication system, Earth sends a Soyuz spacecraft to push the station into deep space. This is a failsafe to protect Earth, but Sho believes this to be a rescue and boards the Soyuz. He is followed by Calvin, who kills the Soyuz crew. A docking breach occurs, and Sho sacrifices himself in an unsuccessful attempt to trap Calvin in the Soyuz. The Soyuz detaches and crashes into the ISS, causing the ISS's orbit to decay again. The remaining survivors, David and Miranda, speculate that Calvin could survive re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, so they plan to lure Calvin into one of the ISS to escape pods. Once inside, David will manually pilot the pod containing Calvin into deep space, thereby isolating it and enabling Miranda to return to Earth in the other pod. David leads Calvin into his pod and launches into space as Miranda launches her pod, and the two pods go in different directions. As Miranda's pod flies in one direction, she records a black box message to warn Earth of Calvin's threat. Subsequently, one pod is hit by debris, while David is attacked by Calvin while trying to pilot. Eventually, one of the two pods lands in the sea and is found by Vietnamese fishermen, while the other pod flies away from Earth. What the Vietnamese fishermen find turns out to be David's pod. Meanwhile, Miranda's pod flies uncontrollably into deep space. On Earth, the fishermen open David's pod despite his warnings, as other boats arrive at the scene.